The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar titled Guiding Principles and Critical Insights for Effective Climate Communication. Next. My name is Jenny Woods, and I'm a project manager for the Local Government Commission. LGC is a nonprofit organization that fosters innovation in local environmental sustainability, economic prosperity, and social equity. Next. LGC helps transform communities through inspiration, practical assistance, and by creating a network of visionary local elected officials and other community leaders. Next. LGC has organized this webinar through our participation in the statewide Energy Efficiency Collaborative. SEEC is an alliance to help cities and counties reduce greenhouse gas emissions and save energy. SEEC is a collaboration between 3 statewide nonprofit organizations and California's 4 investor-owned utilities. Before we get started, I wanted to go over a few logistics. Everyone will be muted during today's webinar except the person speaking. Due to the large number of participants, we ask that you type your question or comment into the question box. I will be summarizing those during the Q&A portion following the presentation. Any of the questions that we don't get to, we'll ask the presenters to respond to after the webinar, and we will make the responses available on our website. Next. Presentations, resources, and questions answered after the webinar and a recording of the webinar will be available on LGC's website following the webinar. Please also note that this webinar is approved for 1 AICP credit. Next. When you log out of the webinar, you will be asked to complete a short survey. Please take a few minutes to provide us with input, which will help us improve future webinars and presentations, choose future webinar topics, and make sure that these webinars are as useful for you as possible. So as we all know, communicating about climate change can be a difficult task. The topic of climate change can seem abstract and complicated to people, and it can also be filled with political tensions and diverse and dissonant opinions. This webinar aims to provide you with clear and specific tools and techniques for how to best communicate about this critical topic. Our expert speakers from ecoAmerica will provide an overview of some of the must-know steps and guiding principles for communicating on climate. They will also provide information and insights about psychological motivations that drive attitudes and behaviors, and share how you can use this information to increase your effectiveness in building public support and political will for climate solutions in your community. As I just mentioned, we are joined today by 2 speakers from ecoAmerica. Dan Barry, Director for ecoAmerica's Momentous Initiative. Before joining ecoAmerica, Dan was Senior Climate Policy Analyst for the District Department of the Environment's Office of Policy and Sustainability. Dan has 25 years of experience with local, state, and national environmental organizations, including VPIRG, Rural Vermont Environmental Working Group, Americans for the Environment, Friends of the Earth, Environmental Defense Fund, and Save Our Environment. Dan has also worked on electoral and issue campaigns and on staff for Representative Bernie Sanders. Carolyn Hodge is a research manager at ecoAmerica, where she is responsible for a range of research projects designed to uncover how to best communicate about climate change with mainstream Americans. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dan and Carolyn, for the rest of the presentation, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Thank you for having us. We're very pleased to be here. I want to thank the Local Government Commission for making time for us to join you today, and to you all in SEEC for the work you do, but also for your interest in communicating. This is an important task that we all have, as important as the policy and program work that we do in many cases, because in order to advance our work and our ideals with the public, we've got to let them know what they are. We've got to let them be a part of our work, and we've got to communicate the benefits. I want to move to the next slide, our agenda, and just briefly let you know what we're up to today. We're going to do a brief introduction of ecoAmerica and Momentous. Caroline will do a research presentation. She's the research manager and knows quite a lot about the American Climate Values Report that we've conducted for 2 years running or possibly longer. We have tons of reports on our website, which we welcome you to take a look at, including American Climate Values. And I must say, there is a tremendous amount of information in these reports, much more than we'd be able to present to you today. So we're going to move through this quickly and really hit the high points. In addition to doing the values-based research that we conduct to figure out what people value and how to reach them through their values, we also are publishing an increasing number of practical guides, including one called Communicating on Climate, the 13 Steps Guide. It's been well received, and I think you'll see when we cover some of the top points there that it's a useful, practical guide for everyday communications on climate. So the next slide is essentially the title or the name of our program, our campaign. It's called Momentous. But on the following slide, slide 4, I'll give you a little bit of background about who we are. ecoAmerica is a nonprofit that's been around for 6 or 7 years. Actually, I think we just celebrated our 8th birthday 2 days ago. And we're a nonprofit that uses consumer research and strategic partnerships to create engagement programs that build awareness around energy, climate, and sustainability issues. So it's a bit of a different take that we use, and it's led us to the Momentous campaign, which is our organizing initiative. And the objective that we have through Momentous is to build institutional leadership, use institutional leadership to build public support, and then generate public will and collective action for climate solutions. And to do this, we're developing a network of trusted leaders, which you'll see on our next slide. And these leaders are the people with whom we're working to reach their constituencies. And the leadership, here's a small sampling of the 150 or so leaders that we have on board with us now. Mayor Greg Nichols was the 51st mayor of Seattle. He started the Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement, which has gotten quite a lot of press and has done some great stuff. Lieutenant Governor Gavin Newsom is on our leadership council. So we count among our leaders quite a number of influential people from 5 key sectors that we find are really important in ordinary Americans' everyday lives: the business sector, the faith sector, healthcare, higher education, and of course, communities. And by that we mean local government on a city and town basis, but also on the county level. The next slide gives a bit of a illustration of our theory of organizing. Essentially, we're creating these partnerships and engaging these organizations by gathering leaders of leaders and institutions of institutions, associations of associations. We hope to reach a critical mass of people through the work that we're doing and through the engagement activities that we're conducting. Our next slide will give you a little bit of a sense of the sorts of services that we provide. We support our partners in their efforts by building out research-based programs for them, by helping them figure out critical means of engaging their communities, and by building communications tools that use these tested frames and messaging to engage their staff, their students, their clients, and citizens, of course, their citizens. So we've got, as you can see on this slide, brands that we've created: Blessed Tomorrow for the faith sector, Solution Generation. Mine is called, it's actually not future ready, this is a little out of date, it's called Climate of Opportunity. We have Climate of Wellness for the health sector, and America Knows How for business. And we use the research reports that we have been generating to provide the critical tools, communications tools that we're getting out, using an organizing principle that we call the path to positive. And all that asks is for our leaders who are engaged with our campaign to lead by example, to engage others, to use their institutional leadership to generate collective impact. And really, it boils down to this. What we're asking our leaders to do is not just do something, but talk about it. This next slide is a cartoon that my boss is very fond of. And it's sort of, we're the ticket counter to the left, and we're not sure why nobody is coming to our movie. And what this really says is, we need a fresh script. We need a script that appeals to mainstream Americans And the best way to do that is to figure out the values that resonate with them and figure out the important ways that we can communicate by touching on those values. And it's important to note that, you know, most people's values are established by the time they're an early adult. We cannot change people's values. What we have to do is use the values basis that we can agree on and work around to change opinions, to provide more information, and to give people options for choices. Briefly, we, on the next slide, we do a lot of work looking at polls. We're as interested in polling as anybody is. And we've really found something that is quite interesting. You know, polling changes on climate awareness and climate concern. But climate as an issue is really almost always near the bottom. While many of the impacts that we know about that are related to climate change score higher, like economic impacts or jobs. Health impacts are a concern that are impacted by climate change, as is infrastructure. And protecting the environment scores highly, but climate is still below there. So there's something that we're not doing right. And our approach is really to try to figure out how to do a better job of communicating with people. And on the next slide, this is just my way of saying, you know, if this is typical America, they've zoned us out. We need to connect better. How are we going to do that? What can we say to people that appeals to their core values and motivates their concern and action? So on the next slide, this is my handoff. Caroline Hodge is the research manager. She's done a tremendous amount of work around the research and helping us establish the values basis for our communications tools and the practical guides. The next slide, though, that I want to just talk about briefly, slide number 12, is the good news. And there's a lot of good news. We can rest assured there is a foundation of understanding about climate change out there. We know this from our research. There is a sense of responsibility that gives us a lot to work with. People think that they have a role. If you look at this, people believe in exceptionalism and compassion. They believe that they can make steps that will make the world better. They believe that they have personal rights to a clean environment, drinking water, air, safe neighborhoods, clean neighborhoods, access to parks and public spaces, natural spaces. But importantly, people do feel that there is a shared responsibility to do something about climate. This is from our values work and from our polling. Companies that pollute have a responsibility. The EPA, or you could say government, has a responsibility. But the bottom bullet is really important. We're finding people do feel that they have a role in solving this problem. And how we get them to play a stronger role is all of our jobs, but hopefully this information that Caroline will give you shortly, starting in the next slide, will help us all figure out how to do a better job of communicating with the public. So with that, I'll hand it off to Caroline and let her discuss psychographic research and the values basis of our work.
Great, thank you, Dan, and Jenny. Thanks so much for having us here. We're thrilled to be here. We talk about climate communication all day long, so it's great to be able to share that with other people who really are interested in learning more about it. So like Dan mentioned, today I'm going to be sharing some of the findings from one of our most recent projects, and that's the American Climate Values Survey. And we completed this research in the spring of this year. It's the fourth round of research that we've done that uses this methodology that I'll be talking about in just a minute. And it netted out some really interesting findings for climate communicators that I think you'll be really interested in hearing about today. And I'm hoping that what I'm going to share with you will change how you think about why we haven't been successful in communicating about climate change and what we can do to really do better. And Dan's section at the end of this presentation will help you to do that as well. Okay, so next slide. I'm going to just start off by touching a little bit on the methodology. And the reason I'm going to do this is the methodology that we use in this research is unique. It's not just polling research. It's not just a regular survey. So this research uses something called the VALS framework. Now this framework was developed by a research organization called SRI International in collaboration with some researchers from Stanford University and UC Berkeley. And so their goal was to develop a tool that could help explain the relationship between people's underlying psychology and their consumer preferences and behavior. So they ended up figuring out this algorithm that does this based on two dimensions. One is people's primary psychological motivation, whether they're motivated by their ideals, their achievement, or their self-expression. And the other dimension is their resource levels. That's not just income, but also education, health, age. And so this tool is mostly used in the private sector to devise marketing strategies for new products. But we decided to apply it to climate and environmental issues in order to glean new insights beyond what we can just get from regular polling and surveys. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to go through 6 of the key findings of the report here today. Like Dan mentioned, there's a lot of information in this research report, and so I'd really encourage you to download the report online after today, but in case you're still hungry for more. But let's go ahead and dive into this one. So this finding is that benefits are essential for action. So what we found is that most Americans aren't really seeing the benefits that doing something about climate change will bring to them personally. Instead, they're mostly hearing about the problem. And maybe they have fears about whether climate solutions could end up hurting them or hurt the economy. So the recommendation from this finding is that we want to connect climate change and climate solutions to real, tangible benefits for people's pocketbooks, for their families, and for their communities. So you really have to sell people on climate solutions based on what's in it for them in order to get them to act. Next slide. All right, this next finding is Americans follow their tribes. So Americans, like most people, rely on their tribes and their, quote, tribal leaders to help them figure out how they should think about certain issues. So their tribes could be their families, their pastors, their political leaders, their favorite newspapers, TV shows. And for most Americans, environmentalists are not part of their tribe. So when people think about climate, they have this reaction like, oh, climate is only for environmentalists. It's not for me. It's for the environmentalist tribe. And because my tribe isn't doing it, then this thing shouldn't really matter. So what we need to do, what the recommendation is to get other tribes beyond just environmentalists to get behind climate solutions. Now, one way of doing this is to work with the leaders of those tribes who interact with Americans in their daily lives and have those leaders serve as role models for climate solutions in both their words and in their actions. Next slide. All right, so this finding is not ready to abandon the American dream. And this might be one of our most important findings, and I think one of the most interesting ones. This is something that we found pretty consistently in our research. And the finding here is that Americans are still retaining their desires to keep up with the Joneses, to get ahead, to work hard, and to see results. Next slide. So in essence, little fun slide here, the American dream is something that most of the public still aspires to. Most of the American public still wants to have a giant refrigerator filled with 14 different flavors of Haagen-Dazs, and I don't know how many types of beer there are there in the bottom shelf on the right. But the irony, the problem with this is that environmental messages often really run contrary to the American dream. Environmental messages, not all of them, but a lot of them are about reducing, about sacrificing, doing more with less. And so in order to fix this problem, we need to really connect climate and energy solutions with the key tenets of the American dream. So things like success, jobs, national prosperity, opportunity. We need to do that rather than attacking basic American values that held within the American dream or asking people to adopt a whole new mindset entirely and to shift their fundamental beliefs. Next slide. Okay, so this next slide is really about how we can inject climate change into the mainstream and turn it from a fringe issue into something that everyday people are behind. So how we do this has to do with getting to a key group in society. So one of the key groups in American society, and this is actually one of the groups that the VALS methodology helped us to identify. They're called achievers in the VALS methodology. These Americans have a strong me and my family first orientation. These achievement-oriented, kind of keep up with the Joneses types, are likely to own a minivan or an SUV. They're probably going to read family-themed magazines. They might attend church meetings and hold management positions. And so they're generally focused on responsibility, on goal attainment, on family, and they're going to resist anything, including action on climate, if it conflicts with those values. And so this is really a key group for climate engagement strategies to reach. And the reason being is that if these Americans don't embrace climate action, or anything for that matter, they're going to block the path for many more Americans who look to them for guidance on how to act, how to behave, what's cool. These are Americans who kind of follow the crowd. And so the key thing that we need to do is reach this group, these achievement-oriented Americans. So how do we do this? Well, one way is to appeal to connections with children and family. Family is really important to this group, like I mentioned. Another is to provide extrinsic motivation for doing something about climate rather than intrinsic motivation. So rather than depending on people to do something about climate change because it's the right thing to do and they feel personally motivated to do it on their own, you want to give people rewards for doing something about climate. You want to implement workplace programs. You can tie doing something about climate change to being successful, whether that's a successful mom or a successful business person. And so these strategies can help give Americans the sense of motivation and security that they're going to need to really engage on climate change. Next slide. Okay, so just as environmental messages are often perceived as being in conflict with the American dream, they're also often seen as elite and alienating, not for everyday people. So the people who are doing something about climate change and leading the pack on solutions are often liberal, educated, and probably on the wealthier side. And so most mainstream folks see people like this doing something about climate change, and you get this tribal reaction again. They think, oh, no, that's not me. You know, doing something about climate change isn't for practical, ordinary people. And so to combat this, we're going to need new messengers who can help change the perception of environmental issues. And that's similar to what I was talking about earlier with getting the leaders of America's tribe to do something about climate change. So we're going to need to have people who ordinary folks can identify with give messages about climate change. Instead of just having people hear about climate from environmentalists, we want them to be hearing about it from their pastors, from their mayors, from their librarians, from their neighborhood leaders. So we want it to be something that's really integrated into the mainstream, and we want people to understand, again, how solutions can benefit them in a tangible way, so that climate doesn't seem elite and alienating anymore, but it seems like something that everyday people can do, and that it's going to bring everyday benefits. Next slide. Okay, so this is just one last slide to kind of drive home this point. There's a sense that the people who are talking about climate change and who are doing something about climate change are part of this elite group. They're wealthy, they're well-educated often, but there's also this kind of holier-than-thou sentiment that can kind of add an additional level of alienation. You know, these images show it really well. The cover of Rolling Stone says, "You idiots," and you know, there's the Bloomberg Business Week with the headline, "It's global warming, stupid." So that's just something that we need to kind of keep in mind when we talk about climate change and when we pick who we get to talk about climate change. We really need to be aware of this feeling that climate is elite, and it's kind of that the people who are doing something about it think that they're better than other people. Okay, so this next slide is go to the perfect, next slide. All right, so this last finding is something that I think is going to be of particular interest to folks on this call, given that local government is often on the front lines of climate preparedness and adaptation efforts. And the finding here is that preparedness can be sort of a, quote, gateway drug for climate action. So unlike mitigation, which can be somewhat politically charged, preparing is a little more neutral, and it evokes the idea of personal responsibility and also proactiveness, and those are really key ideals for many Americans. So if you're working with a group that's particularly resistant to climate action, preparedness can be a good gateway to get people to later do something a little bit more dramatic. All right, next slide. All right, so this slide just shows a few summary recommendations from the American Climate Values Survey. And you're going to recognize some of them based on what I've talked about today, but others come from findings in the report that we didn't have time to cover today. So just again, you can download the report if you want to get the full set of recommendations. We also have a recommendation supplement that's on our website, and we'll make sure that that link gets out to you. All right, so I'm going to hand it back over to Dan. So Dan's going to be taking all this research that, next slide, taking out the research that I've just talked about and putting it into a form, or showing you how we've already put it into a form that's really practical and really applicable for anyone who's working to communicate with Americans about climate and energy issues, and that's the 13 Steps and Guiding Principles Guide. So take it away, Dan.
Thanks, Caroline. Thank you very much. Yeah, as Caroline has shown, there are really some core values from which we can better communicate positive choices and actions that people will grasp, and grasp in a way that makes them feel that they are participating in a positive set of actions that benefits them, their families, and their community. And so what you're looking at right now is the cover of our Communicating on Climate Guide, which is available online, and it's very easy to digest. It's a short report. It's really a handy desk reference for how you communicate in writing, in putting speeches together, web content, talking points, tweets, whatever you use to communicate your policies and programs can benefit, I think, by keeping these 13 steps in mind. And it's because they do appeal to these values, these concerns, and motivations. On the next slide, this is just a quick rundown of the 13 steps. Start with people, stay with people. Connect on common values. Acknowledge ambivalence. Scale from personal to planet. Sequencing matters. Using facts, not science, helpful. It's helpful to inspire and empower people. Of course, be solutions focused, and that should be easy for folks on this call. Describe, don't label. Have at least one powerful fact from a trusted messenger, and that gets to Caroline's point that as tribal people, we rely on our trusted messengers to help us form opinions and help us realize our core values. Prepare, don't adapt. That's about language choice. Speak from the mountaintops. Don't fight in the trenches. And that's just really, as leaders of people, we have the opportunity to not get into the sort of nitty-gritty debate about whether climate change is happening or not. We can offer solutions, and it gives us an empowered position from which to work. But step 13, which is, you'll find this practical tip in any issue or political campaign, any advertising campaign out there, message discipline is critical. So on the next slide, I'll go, and I'm not going to cover all 13 steps in any level of detail because we just don't have the time, but start with people, stay with people is really a core tenet of the communication strategies and approaches that we put out there. Polar bears and glaciers are certainly worth our concern, but they don't resonate with mainstream Americans. They're not realities that they interact with on a regular basis. So a hopeful and people-oriented frame is more likely to gain people's interest in the programs that we have and the work that we do. So you talk about them, you talk about their families, you talk about how your work can benefit them. The next slide is a before slide that the San Diego Foundation has provided us, and it's this is the cover, front and back cover of an annual report that the San Diego Foundation put out talking about their climate work. And if you look at the front cover, it's colorful enough, but the city is in a distance, and the little round bullets, there's one bullet or one image that includes a person, and the back cover is just dismal. I mean, it's grayscale, and it lists all of the terrible impacts from climate. Now, these are important for people to know. Don't get me wrong, but they're not motivating. Nobody wants to read this book. But on the next slide, the very next year, the San Diego Foundation revamped their approach to communicating their program. If you look at this front cover, it's just as colorful, but it's all about people. And it's not just ordinary people. There are ordinary people depicted here, but these are recognized leaders. These are people that are known in San Diego as leaders in this work. And so you can see that it's more inviting, it's more human scale, and it does provide a better sense of hope for people who are looking to local leadership to help them understand and solve these problems. On the next slide, step number 2 of the 13 steps is to connect on common values. There are so many different ways because there are so many values that thrive and prosper within any community. When you figure out those values and you figure out how to frame your messaging around those values, it becomes easier to communicate the benefits of the program that you're advancing, the benefits to the families, to the individuals, and to the community at large. And the next slide is another illustration. Chris Van Hollen from Maryland recently dropped this climate bill, and trust me, there are not a lot of climate bills being introduced in Congress lately. But when he dropped this bill, he named it something which we found very interesting, the Healthy Climate and Family Security Act. So there are some values in the name of this very bill, the values of health, the value of family, and the value of security. And so it's a way really to advance values in a very upfront way. It's not sugarcoating. It's a piece of congressional legislation. There's nothing really warm and fuzzy about it. But when you start describing it in this way, it does make it more accessible to people. It makes it resonate a little bit more with them on a mainstream, ordinary, day-to-day level. The next slide highlights step number 3, which is acknowledge ambivalence. And I want to talk about this one because it does sort of get to the research finding that people consider climate action and climate science and the discussion around climate to be alienating. It's too political for people. They don't want to get involved because they're not certain. They may not understand the science completely. They know that science doesn't hold all the answers, that it's a dynamic discipline that is constantly evolving. And so when we're talking about our issues with people, it's helpful up front to comfort them by saying, we don't have all the answers yet about this problem. But since people are willing and able to learn, and they are willing and able to change their opinions and to update their opinions, we need to bring them along by letting them understand it's okay that they don't have all the answers. Nobody does. Nobody has all the answers yet. This is something we're working on solving together. And if you acknowledge that ambivalence, you don't alienate people. You don't shut them out of the conversation, which too many times is a mistake that advocates have made, and they've lost a part of their audience as a result of that. On the next slide, we skip down a couple and we get to use facts, not science. So, people believe that the science is accurate, even if they don't understand it completely. But locally relevant facts about energy and about climate issues and about sustainability are going to be a lot less alienating to people and more easily understood than engaging in a scientific discussion. So you can talk about the science of global warming, but you can more readily agree on commonly accessible facts like a recent storm event or a trend in hot weather or damage from stormwater or sea level rise or any of these things that people are seeing themselves. They're experiencing them, and it illustrates the science at play, but brings it home a lot more closely to people. And it is a fact. I mean, and I know this is true in California. This is true across the country and around the globe. Climate change and the impacts around climate are no longer remote issues. They are being experienced by people increasingly at home. We're still drawing all the connections, and we have to be careful about not scaring people with some of these facts and using them to bring them into the discussion, but using the locally relevant facts, it's just simply more relevant and more accessible to people than a broad scientific discussion. On the next slide, we skip ahead again to tip number 8, be solutions focused. Well, I mean, this is easy for the folks on this call because, having seen the folks that are participating and knowing a bit about the kind of work that your organizations likely do, these are issues that you are trying to solve. We all have solutions that we can offer, and those should be our selling points. So we don't want to bury the lead by only talking about the problems, only talking about the dangers, only talking about the risks. If we lead with the solutions, and if we're able to bring that into discussion early on, then we can keep people with us. So talk about that. Talk about your solutions every time you mention a challenge. Make sure that the solution is part of the discussion. It will keep hope alive with people about themselves and about their families and about their community. The next slide, looks like I skipped ahead a little bit. The last slide that I want to talk about, and Caroline talked about this, so I will go quickly. Prepare, don't adapt. Again, language is important, and even individual word choices make a difference. So when you say adaptation, it's hard for people to understand. Mainstream, ordinary Americans don't have a real sense of what adaptation means, means, and they really don't understand mitigation when you're talking about reducing climate pollution. So use these accessible word choices and like preparation and savings and clean air and stronger communities. These are things that people can understand a little more readily than sort of wonky or scientific terms. So on the next, I'm going to show you something briefly. This is our practical application, and this is a series of slides that we'll go through that talk about, give an example of how some of these principles, these guiding principles from our 13 Steps Guide, can be used in a, well, this is a sample speech that we put together, and again, you can here, this is a, the illustration that we have in our report, and it's called Putting Method into Practice. And what it does is, as I said, it gives a sample speech and sort of pulls out the tips that we've just talked about. And as above, I'm not going to go through all 13 of them because we want to save time for questions and answers. But on the next slide, this speech starts by showing an understanding of an appreciation of the audience. So in any kind of communication with values, you want to get right in line with your audience, whether in person or whether they're reading your material, to let them know you're a part of the community as well. And on the next slide, you continue by talking about local issues and core values that are present in that community. You continue to build rapport. And that, again, is an important set of actions in order to build trust with the audience. So they will listen. The alienation category that we don't want to be in. We want to be with them as a part of the community. On the next slide, this part of the speech talks about how, acknowledging ambivalence up front, it introduces concepts around climate change, but respects and shows respect for the potential spectrum of the audience, their attitudes, their level of understanding, their engagement with the issue. Again, drawing people in is important. It's a sales pitch in many ways, and as much as we may resist that approach, there's a reason why marketing and advertising people understand sales as a way of gaining access to people's concern and understanding, and, well, in their case, pocketbooks. But we're marketing solutions, and we need to market them as effectively as traditional marketers do. On the next slide, we skip ahead, and this again gets to use facts, to the principle of using facts, not science. In this case, the speaker says the water level is down and the higher water temperatures are impacting fish counts and fish health. Our main source of clean drinking water is diminishing. That is a local fact in this community, our imaginary community, that people will understand. They will know that, and it will gain credibility for the speaker that they know what they're talking about. And yeah, okay, for the person in the audience, they'll be, yeah, there's something here for me to be concerned about. On the next slide, we go to the be solutions focused element of this thing. Our imaginary speaker's name is Janine. I don't know why. It's a very fine name. I like it. But what she's doing here is talking about leaders in the community already that have started doing something to help. Some of the high schools. You can talk about the mayor. You can talk about solutions and solution leaders that are working right now, and of course make sure that these leaders are locally relevant people that are leading on this issue right now, and that they are likely to be known by people. Number 10, that's the trusted messenger. So you can talk about the local paper or the mayor or the school principal, or through our Momentous campaign, we're building leadership in other sectors: faith, higher education, business, healthcare. We're trying to provide this sort of podium for people to speak from, where those trusted leaders can become a part of the discussion as well. Number 11, prepare, don't adapt. Using wise word choice, and I discussed that just a few minutes ago. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but it is important to really carefully think about these terms. And there are so many different terms that are available that we should be able to find things that resonate with the particular audience. And it is, again, it's important to know your audience so you can speak to them on their level in ways that will engage them. And on the next slide, I show tip number 13, and that's something I said, at the beginning of this thing. You got to repeat your message. You got to be disciplined in repeating your message in the same fashion. You know, there's an old saying out there that, you know, you've got to hit people 8 times with a message content before it really sticks with them. That's hard to do, but it's really hard for your message to stick if it varies. If it's different from case to case, then you're not going to be able to really cement your message and gain the important critical communications edge that you need on this stuff. So that's why message discipline is critical. There's a reason why there are people on political campaigns whose sole job is to form and enforce message discipline in all communications. So that's a run through of sort of this practical application. And again, I encourage you to take a look at our reports. We certainly would love to hear from you if you have any questions aside from questions that we're getting now in this webinar. But now I want to hand it over because we have this is a little commercial announcement. Caroline, if you can take it from here, we have an event coming up next Thursday that some of you may be very interested in. I'll let Caroline talk to you about it.
Great. So if we just want to go to the next slide real quick. Perfect. Okay, so we're super excited to be releasing a brand new climate communications guide. We produced this in collaboration with a group at Columbia University called the Center for Research on Environmental Decisions. The name of the guide is Connecting on Climate, a guide to effective climate change communication. And this guide incorporates all of the research that we've done over the past 8 years since we've been around, and it also includes a lot of academic, social science-based research, and that's where folks from Columbia really were able to contribute a lot of that. And so the guide, it is based on. Also, I want to make clear that it includes plenty of recommendations about how to put that research into practice. There are tip sections, there are call-out boxes, there are sidebars, and so it's hopefully a really user-friendly guide. And also, I want to emphasize that there's a lot of new information in the guide that we haven't covered today. So I'd really encourage you to sign up for a webinar that we're going to be hosting. It's going to be next Thursday. It'll be from 3:30 to 4:45 Eastern. So that would be 12:30 to 1:45 Pacific. And it's free, open to the public, and we'll make sure to get that link out to you. And you can also feel free to email me if you have any questions. And lastly, you can visit our website for the guide, which is connectingonclimate.org. And you can sign up to get a little notification when we release the guide, which will also be next Thursday, December 11th. All right, go to the next slide real quick. This just is our email addresses. I think Jenny is going to be sending an email out with everything, so you'll have it in your inbox. But like Dan said, feel free to contact us if you have any questions. We love talking with people who are really trying to put this research into practice. It really helps us to understand better what we need to do and how we can make our research more applicable and what other themes we need to explore. So Dan, unless you have any last words, I guess we can move on to Q&A.
I also want to say thank you. Thanks to everybody who joined us today, and thanks Jenny and Local Government Commission for having us. It was a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, likewise.
Great. Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Caroline. That was a really great, very interesting presentation and a lot of really helpful practical tips. So before we get started, I just wanted to remind you, if you have any questions for either Caroline or Dan, please type them into the question box and we'll get those answered for you. And as Caroline just mentioned, we will be sending out an email probably tomorrow with a link to all of the resources, the PowerPoint, a recording of the webinar, and all of the resources that they kind of mentioned today, as well as information about the webinar that Caroline was discussing and a link to register. So that information will become available to you very soon. So for the first question is, aren't we just ignoring wasteful, high-carbon consumption patterns or behaviors of mainstream tribes when we make appeals to the extrinsic?
Yeah, I can go ahead and take this question. This is a fantastic question. I'm really glad that this was asked. And so I think the answer is that you can still have extrinsic rewards that aren't high carbon. So there's actually a concept that we cover in this forthcoming communications guide, Connecting on Climate. So you can read more about it there. But basically there's research showing that some of the most motivating rewards are things that are not material and that are things that are social. So it's things like having your photo up on the wall, or being recognized at a company meeting. And so we really crave social recognition, and this recognition doesn't have to involve material goods. And I think this question also gets to a larger point that I really want to emphasize, which is that we need to make climate appeal to the mainstream if we want to achieve any kind of scale with solutions. But that, importantly, doesn't mean that we have to endorse these existing consumption habits, which are often very high carbon, of kind of the mainstream America. It just means that we need to endorse the existing values of mainstream to reach them where they are and bring them along, rather than presenting something that you need to get rid of your SUV and you need to stop driving so much and you need to do all these things and do more with less and sacrifice. That's just people are shut down immediately, and so we have to kind of find creative ways to get people where they are and make incremental change.
And I just want to briefly say I found it very interesting. Ford Motor Company, their most popular vehicle is the F-150 pickup truck, and they are currently advertising around the fact that they've substituted materials to lighten the chassis, thereby saving fuel and energy and making a stronger, better truck. And so you can even see within mainstream marketing some glimmers of hope where the idea of conservation and the idea of doing better with what you've got is starting to take hold. And these are cyclical and sometimes faddish approaches to advertising, but it is impressive to see that some of those connections are being made.
Great, thank you, Dan. Thank you, Caroline. If you have any final questions, please type them into the questions box now. I'll give it just about 30 seconds or so to give people time to type things in, and if not, we'll end a few minutes early today. Okay, we just got another question. So your Ford F-150 example, in that and similar, where's the line between your example and greenwashing?
Oh, that's a great question. Greenwashing to me, and it's not on my bio, but for many years I monitored the greenwashing, the anti-environmental movement, the property rights movement as a job. I did tactical research, so I understand them fairly well. And what I think about with greenwashing primarily is telling bald-faced lies about your environmental commitment. And I don't know that I would accuse Ford of doing that by emphasizing a technological advance that they're trying to move. Now, the fact of the matter is they are selling a big, heavy vehicle that is probably unnecessary for most of the people who own it. So, I guess that's the element of greenwashing that people might be concerned about. But I don't know. I wouldn't put it in the same category. There are lots of other companies out there that are trying more, I think, consistently and in good faith to try to talk about their environmental commitment. In this case, I think they're advertising about the F-150 falls more into that than in greenwashing. Interestingly, Ford is also about to start manufacturing a fleet vehicle, an electric bicycle, in mass numbers, and it'll be interesting to see how they market that, whether that falls in some people's minds under the category of greenwashing.
Great, thank you. Hopefully that answered the question. You can provide a follow-up question if you would like to discuss further. Our next question is, how do you deal with deniers?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's one we've spoken about quite a bit in here. And I guess the simple answer is we don't. I mean, there's a certain sense that the people we really are trying to influence, again, with incremental change and ideas about how they can incrementally improve their lives and improve their community, are the mainstream folks that are willing to hear our message and that are reachable. The deniers, in my mind, they're not reachable. I mean, they've hardened their decision and have decided that it's not a problem that's worth that's worth their attention. But I know Caroline has a lot of ideas around this too, because this is something she thinks quite a bit about. So I'll hand it off to Caroline and get her thoughts too.
Great, thanks. And yeah, again, this is just you're teaming me up so well here for the for the Connecting on Climate guide, because this is something that we go into in depth in the guide, and it's not something that we cover a ton in our other research. So I think there are a couple things that I would say. One is to focus on solutions. I think a lot of deniers are really tired of hearing about the problem over and over again. And if you can just skip the problem altogether and just forge on ahead to solutions, that can be a really effective technique. But when you do talk about solutions, you want to make sure that you're focusing on solutions that these people believe in. There's some evidence. There's a guy at Yale named Dan Kahan who does some interesting work on climate attitudes, and what he finds is that people who are very conservative are more willing to accept that climate change exists when they hear about solutions that jive with their values and worldviews. And so you can imagine most of the solutions that people hear about to climate change are, more government regulation, more intervention in our lives, and people who are conservative are going to kind of bristle at that. So if you can instead propose solutions that align with conservative values, and you focus on the solutions first rather than the problem, you can sometimes get some traction. I think just one other quick recommendation is to not overwhelm people with facts. I think there's this desire to kind of enter into this battle of, here's the science is settled, look at this graph, look at these facts, look at these statistics, and that is just kind of opens the door for an argument, and that's not what you want to do. You want to speak from the mountaintops, not from the trenches. That's one of our tips. You want to not get caught in the weeds of what's happening, but really make a values-based argument and focus on solutions, I think is kind of the overall recommendation that I would give there.
Thank you, Caroline and Dan. Another question is, can you go into more detail on local leaders that may have influence in their communities? There seems to be a decreasing trend of engagement in local happenings, so I wonder how relevant local leaders are still.
Well, that's a good question, and that really does get to the core of this momentous campaign that we're building. And our perception is that there are plenty of local leaders across the various key sectors, and I look at these sectors as intentional communities. People choose a congregation to attend. They choose a healthcare provider. They choose a school to go to for higher education. They choose what businesses they want to work. They want to buy from, and they live within a community where all of these intentional communities overlap with one another, and that's sort of the fabric of the community. Our approach is working with the national associations within each of these sectors and working increasingly with those leaders that work in the healthcare industry and in the faith sector, that people are interested in providing leadership on this. They just don't know how. That's part of the problem. It is a complicated issue, and just like mainstream ordinary Americans, just like regular citizens, a lot of the leaders in our communities who feel that they have a role to play in this aren't exactly sure how to tackle the question, how to lead on this. And so that's one of the things we're hoping to do with this research and with these communications guides is to provide really easy, accessible means for leaders that do have concern to get involved in the discussion in a way that they feel is contributory to finding and advancing solutions. And the 150 leaders that we have of these national associations and organizations are working really hard with us to make sure that we know the best way to serve their membership, and that their membership can then transmit that information more broadly to a mainstream audience. So it's important to hear what you just asked, that there's a sense out there that community leadership is waning, that it's not strong, that it's not stepping up. That is something that we need to know about. That's really the problem we're trying to solve by creating this movement and by harmonizing message frames and message content so it makes sense across all of the sectors in all of these tribes that we're working through.
Thank you. The next is kind of a comment, and they said, fantastic webinar, and I'm interested to see what tools will be available for local communities to help us. Example, a one-year blog sequence that we can use as a basic template. So I don't know if there's anything you want to add, or if you have plans to create any additional resources or templates for local governments to use.
I love that comment, and I'm sure Caroline does too. We've been working hard to put this thing together for the last year, and we're now as an organization in the phase we're shifting gears into providing exactly the sort of stuff that you mentioned. You know, a blog series, series of talking points, easy tweets that can be retweeted by local leaders around an event or an occasion or something that's happening in the community. And so we're right now building that toolbox, but getting a question like this really reinforces the need, and the more we're able to reach out to our leaders, the more we'll be able to fine-tune stuff. So can we do a sample speech for a local leader? Yeah, we can. Can we do model sermons for congressional or congregational leaders in the faith sector? Absolutely. That's part of the work that we're doing now. But what else? I mean, we need to hear from folks that are using these tools, which ones are effective, which ones we haven't thought of yet that are used by folks in social media or traditional media or other means, and start working on producing that. And I'll give you an example. In our health sector, our health director, my colleague, has been getting a question about a poster. Okay, posters seem really old-fashioned, but think about it. When you're at the doctor's office, you're sitting in that examination room sometimes, well, it seems like forever, but for quite some time, and they do have some interesting informational posters on the wall. What else are you going to do? You're going to look at that poster, and so there's been a question. Can you help us with that? Can you help us do something that talks about climate implications around personal and public health that we can then just post, so that while we've got our client, what do we call them? Customer in the medical office, they can be learning something about this issue. That's a way we can communicate our concern and our focus on this. So yeah, these are the things that we're building now, and certainly love the feedback that we get on what you need and what you can use.
Great, and I think LGC would be more than happy to help support and serve as a conduit between the local governments on this webinar and others that we work with, and you guys at ecoAmerica. And I think we should try to find a way to help pass along those ideas for what kinds of resources and templates would be useful along to you. So let's definitely connect about that. The next is a comment saying, it seems like in this day and age you need to work with television and internet personalities too. I don't know if you want to add anything there.
Well, yeah, that's a really good point. We've been asked before, are you working with sports personalities? Are you working with internet personalities? Are you working with Hollywood? We would love to. We really would. And we are exploring the means to do that. But a lot of that stuff is harder for us as an advocacy group and as a communications-oriented group to control. I mean, the ways of Hollywood are very difficult to crack. And while there is some promising movement, we were pleased to see Days of Living Dangerously, but we're a little concerned about the message content because, again, we're really all about providing a positive frame and hopeful messaging that people can attach themselves to, not more, sort of doom and gloom oriented stuff. So we would rather have seen that be more positive oriented. But really, getting into Hollywood is it's a very difficult thing. We do have Ed Begley Jr., who's a very well-known Hollywood person who is a part of our leadership, and so we're looking at that, and that's something that we're aware would be helpful. Popular culture. It's difficult to crack sometimes. It's hard to influence, but when you can, the impact can be really broad and sudden. So we hope we can do that. But really, on the community level, where people interact on a day-to-day basis with their trusted leaders, that's really the area where we're going to focus first.
Right, and just to add to that, I mean, we would love to have Oprah, or that's something that I think that the climate movement and the environmental movement has suffered from, is having one or a couple of leaders who mainstream Americans can identify with. I mean, Al Gore was great for a lot of people, but he's also an extremely divisive person. So that would be fantastic to move in that direction, and it's something that we'd like to look into.
Great. Well, we're just at the end of our webinar, but I'll just jump in and share these last couple of comments that I have here. Another comment is no question here, but just wanted to say that this is so refreshing to hear your ideas and glad for the work that you do. And then another individual, same individual said, what has value here is this messaging is not spin, and that translates to success. So I think with that, I'm going to close off. There are a few other questions we'll send follow-up and put on our website. But again, all of the presenters' emails are on the screen here, so I think feel free to contact them with any further questions you may have. Feel free to contact me. And just thank you again to Dan and Caroline for the great presentation today and all the really helpful information. So please remember that all the PowerPoints and a recording and resources will be made available on our website in the next 1 to 2 days. And lastly, I encourage you to take a few minutes to fill out the survey. So that concludes our webinar for today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Take care.